Friends, I welcome you live on YouTube 24. Irina Uzlova is working for you, and with us is Russian political technologist Abbas Galyamov. Abbas, hello, glad to see you on our air. Hello, Irina. Thank you to everyone who joined us this Sunday, November 17, a difficult day when Putin once again demonstrated his version of peace vividly, starting from the very night and morning. 120 missiles and 90 drones were launched into Ukraine, targeting energy infrastructure amid cold weather. While this is unsurprising, it happened. Meanwhile, today, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, after speaking with Putin on Friday for the first time in 2 years before the G20 summit, mentioned their conversation. But contributed to the recognition that little has changed in the Russian president's views on the war. Scholz says this is not good news, and in 3 years of full-scale war and nearly 11 years since the 2008 annexation of Georgia, has Scholz not realized that little has changed in the Russian president's views? I think the timing of the call was wrong. It may make sense to occasionally check if Putin's position has changed, though personal calls aren't necessary. Tools like the foreign ministry work too. Even if Scholz tried to persuade him, the timing was bad, as Trump's victory and his appointments give Putin significant hope. And even if, let's say 2 or 3 weeks ago, Putin was still ready to flinch, now he feels that he is on a roll. Scholz apparently said something to him that Putin didn't like, and Putin decided to respond the way he did. Although, I don't rule out that for myself, I don't know, and few people know how much hand-holding Putin has in regulating all this shelling. Belousov enjoys Putin's serious trust, and I don't rule out that he has a mandate to fire at his discretion, so to speak. That is, he can decide when and how to shell as he sees fit.
Путин регулирует вот эти вот все, так сказать, обстрелы. Ну, Белоусов пользуется очень серьезным доверием, министр обороны российский, пользуется серьезным доверием Путина, и я не исключаю, что у него есть мандат на стрельбу.
He doesn't really like to work now. In his youth he worked, and now you see he doesn't want to be distracted from swimming in the pool. So I don't rule out that the decision to intensify the shelling was made at the level of Belousov, who decides how and when. It should be understood that until the latest reshuffle in the government in May and June, Belousov was a staunch ally of Patrushev, the leader of the Hawk camp. But now the camp has begun to fall apart, and Belousov is in the process of reformatting. Nevertheless, he probably remains one of the ideological strongholds of this camp, although perhaps without Patrushev. He has a direct line to Putin, and he may have decided to play for aggravation on his own. He may have seen that Putin is dialoguing, and as a hawk, he doesn't like the very idea of dialogue. Hawks are not against dialogue, but only from a position of strength,
Им не нравится сама идея диалога ястреба. ястребом. Ну, то есть они не против диалога, но с позиции прям, понимаете, силы, да. А когда, значит, ну, там...
They don't want to give in, and they agree to escalate, perhaps within the mandate that he has from Putin.
Возможно, в рамках того мандата, который у него есть, понимаете, от Путина изначально данного.
He himself made the decision, so to speak, to raise the stakes in the game. And the last thing I want to do is to act as a devil's advocate, so to speak, to tell you that Putin had nothing to do with it. But in this case, I really don't rule out that he had nothing to do with it. This in no way serves as an excuse for him, because war is in any case criminal, and so on. This tactical escalation could be a personal decision by Putin or a move by the hawkish camp, unhappy with possible negotiations and trying to complicate them. Remember, Putin issued his ultimatum just before the Swiss peace summit started.
Вы помните, буквально за день до его начала он выкатил свой ультиматум. Там были какие-то...
There were such demands. Give me the 4 regions that I manage, so to speak, to stick in my foot. Then, not to join NATO, neutral status, plus some internal relaxations for the Russian language, the Russian-speaking minority, and so on. Yes, some guarantees. He did not name any other points.
Вот, он других пунктов не называл. А потом проходит какое-то время, и Лавров, например, тоже один из тех, кто лежит...
Then some time passes, and Lavrov, one of those who lie tightly under these hawks, takes and adds a new demand on his own behalf. Yes, we agreed to negotiations, but in addition to the demands that Putin has voiced, we also want the sanctions lifted.
Отмены санкций. Это новое требование, оно, конечно же, очень сильно осложнило перспективы переговоров, потому что, значит, если те требования, которые выкатил Путин, их теоретически можно...
We understand, but this tactic and methodology is consistent with us, for example, with military expert Alexander Muzienko, who is also a frequent guest on my airwaves. He says that perhaps this demonstration of the Kremlin's power, these shellings before Trump's inauguration, may continue, may be repeated. They have a reserve. They've been saving up. It's all one machine, one military system. Are they trying to intimidate or provoke a response from world leaders using force and ultimatums against Putin's actions? Irina, it's important to distinguish between frontline offensives and shelling of civilian cities. Putin understands Trump well, as both are cynics who respect only force.
Потому что все не винтики его одной военной машины, да, ваш посыл прекрасно понимаем мы о вас, и они просто Путину, который устал работать и не хочет работы, много, но ему нужна война.
And accordingly, by the time Trump takes over the U.S. presidency on January 20th, you need to come in maximum physical shape, like an athlete before the Olympics. You have to be ready, because if you come in maximum form, like a winner, when your army is advancing, then Trump will join you and put pressure on Zelensky. He will say, agree, there's nowhere else to go. And if Putin hears Trump will sit in the chair, and the moment Putin's offensive is exhausted, tongue on his shoulder, Trump in this situation will not offer Putin a good deal. In this situation, Ukraine will be on the end, Ukraine is effectively on the defensive, and Putin's army is exhausted, can't offensive. Trump will offer a good deal to Zelensky. The real risk is there, so of course he has to step up. But this applies precisely to victories at the front. Shelling of peaceful cities does not strengthen Putin's position now to the extent that it would be strengthened by a victory at the front. The shelling of peaceful cities, they are constantly in the news, they show this picture, dead civilians, and so on. This, of course, tilts American public opinion not in favor of Putin, but in favor of Ukraine. And Trump, of course, in one form or another, has to reckon with this public opinion.
А в этот момент путинское наступление выдохлось, язык у него на плече, ну так Трамп в этой ситуации не предложит Путину хорошую сделку. В этой ситуации уже Украина будет на коне. Ну, то есть Украина эффективно обороняется, путинская армия выдохлась, наступать не может. И в этой ситуации Трамп уже...
While the election is certainly over, there will be new midterm congressional elections in 2 years, and it matters who controls Congress. That's why, if victory on the front really strengthens Putin's position, shelling peaceful cities doesn't work much in his favor. Why do I still don't rule out that this game is being played apart from Putin himself?
Обстрел мирных городов, понимаете, они же, они даются в новостях постоянно, да, дается там вот эта телевизионная картинка, там погибшие люди мирные и так далее. И это, конечно, накручивает американское общественное мнение не в пользу Путина.
Although I repeat, you are right. Within the mandate that Putin gave to the defense minister, of course, as Belousov is in no way a revolutionary, not a rebel, not intriguing against Putin, he is.
Конгресса, и тоже очень важно, кто будет контролировать Конгресс. Вот, и поэтому вот если, повторюсь, победа на фронте реально укрепляет позиции Путина, то вот обстрел мирных городов, он такой, я говорю, работает не сильно в его пользу.
But nevertheless, while Putin originally issued this mandate, Belousov is trying to worsen the prospects for peace talks on his own within the framework of this mandate.
Конечно, Белоусов ни в коем случае не революционер, не бунтарь, так сказать, против Путина не интригует, да? Это да. Но, тем не менее, если Путин изначально этот мандат выдал, да, то Белоусов в рамках этого мандата пытается ухудшить перспективы мирных переговоров самостоятельно.
I don't rule out that shelling peaceful cities isn't beneficial to Putin and doesn't strengthen his position. This shows him as a genocidal figure using terror tactics. Regarding negotiations in the front, the Kursk region is still partially occupied, with over 600 square kilometers under control. The Washington Post reports that Russia wants to reclaim Kursk before negotiations. Russian troops there are struggling, and Putin seeks to retain it as a strategic advantage, not out of concern.
Частью оккупировано более 600 квадратных километров украинскими войсками. Вашингтон-Пост пишет, напоминает, что Россия хочет вернуть Курскую область до начала возможных переговоров. Форбс пишет, что российские войска там истекают буквально кровью. А действительно, Путин сейчас, после уже 100 плюс дней оккупации части Курской области, вспомнил о ней только лишь потому, что ему надо этот козырь ни в коем случае не дать Украине, а забрать обратно себе перед переговорами, а не потому, что ему жаль, например,
for local residents protesting life there. He has no sympathy for people of Kursk region. I think the system is behaving in a Khan-like manner towards them. That is, really leaving people, as they call it, in a clear field, without any help. Although, in fact, because, look, the country, and 150 million, here's 150 million. And of course, on the scale of such a huge country, with enough resources, it would be possible to solve the problem of several thousand families. Moreover, as I have already said, they are not asking for cottages on Rubliovka or in Barvika. They would agree to some small rooms. But the system absolutely refuses to solve their problems.
Система напрочь отказывается решать их проблемы. Я думаю, это идет лично от Путина. То есть лично Путин испытывает по отношению к ним такие неприятности.
I believe this is coming from Putin personally. That is, Putin dislikes these people because they are not behaving the way he expects them to behave. He has a certain picture image in his head of the Russian people, who, in his opinion, should have gone into the forests, partisan, fought and died for the glory of Putin and the fatherland. And they, scoundrels, ran away and still dare to raise their voices. On the other hand, the Kursk region has become a symbol of Putin's defeats and failures. Of course, he wants to liberate this territory, not because of the people, but because he cannot tolerate defeats. His entire legitimacy is based on constant victories, and here is such a resounding slap in the face. If he had the opportunity to retake the area earlier, he would have done it already. Now, probably, they have finally accumulated some reserve, enough people to try to repel this territory. In addition, there is an understanding that this issue needs to be closed by January 20th. It is more profitable to come to negotiations with a position where your troops control a part of Ukrainian territory and Ukraine does not control anything on your territory. Then you are on a horse. And if both sides control something, it is not clear who is on top. Trump, as I've said before, is heavily aiding in the liberation of territory to triumphantly hoist the banner of victory. Against this background, it is noteworthy that various officials in the Kursk region have been fired over the past 2 weeks. They seem to be looking for scapegoats and have begun to realize why the Kremlin took this particular path and not another. For example, the one I suggested a couple of days ago on the air with my colleague Igor Gavrishchuk. We could allocate apartments to the protesters, of whom there are only 4 dozen, and film propaganda stories about it, showing how the authorities care about everyone. But the Kremlin chooses to leave them in the middle of the forest and send them off to guerrilla warfare, while firing officials who are also beginning to raise their voices. Why is this happening? Apparently, those who could come up with unconventional propaganda moves have run out. The only ones left are those who work in a formulaic manner. Although the Kremlin propaganda bloc is still in place, and there are quite intelligent people working there whom I know personally. They are cynical, but they are no dumber than I am. Of course, if something depended on them, they would have solved the problem of these people long ago and shown how Putin cares about the people. However, nothing depends on them. Putin decides everything. And as I said before, I assume that he personally dislikes these people. No one will argue with Putin. Kirienko, for example, won't. That is why he has been sitting next to Putin for 25 years. He knows that there is no need to argue, and those who did argue have long since left. That's why they hear that Putin has a negative attitude towards these people. Yes, that's why they are given a ridiculous 10,000 as compensation. Yes, and this 10 has not been paid to all of them, and they are not resettled. Well, the Kremlin is very bureaucratized now. It has become really authoritarian. In such systems, it is not customary to vote from below. Even if you understand perfectly well that the decision of your superiors is wrong, you will not challenge it anyway. Yes, simply because you want to live. And that's why Putin's negativity is just rolling down from the top. The whole vertical is producing you. The firing of local officials that you mentioned. 2 district heads were fired. This was by no means an initiative of the Kremlin. The Kremlin obviously distanced itself from this story, and the governor was told, well, deal with it yourself. The Kremlin does this all the time when it doesn't know how, when it doesn't have a clear plan for how to act. Because look, the Kremlin officials, I repeat, they realize that they need to satisfy people's demands, but they don't want to argue with Putin, so they tell the governor to deal with it himself. In tough situations, they step aside and the governor does what he can. Firing 2 municipal heads, he was scared by the protests but hoped it would help. Remember, he's newly elected, and these officials are from his predecessor, who is now in the federal government. Smirnov, the current head of the region, apparently trying to get out of it and not feeling any particularly warm feelings towards the people of his predecessor, is getting rid of them at the same time. It is also understandable. Such a vertical of management, of course. But what has already come out? We wanted a different one, but we got this one. Friends, I remind you, I am Irina Uzlova. With me is Bas Galyamov, a political technologist. We are working in the live YouTube. Already 2 people are with us. Thank you for joining us. And please actively put your likes. This will allow our conversation to be promoted on YouTube 24. And Abbas, also subscribe. Please direct link to YouTube Abbas Galyamov under our video. Abbas, you mentioned earlier that since the reformatting of the Russian government, there has been turbulence between the war hawks and those advocating for peace. Can you please elaborate on these trends? What is happening there? Is it only a change of names, or is it a change of situation inside the Kremlin as well? See, the chief hawk of Russian politics, Patrushev, was essentially retired by Putin. He was formally given the position of presidential aide for shipbuilding. People whisper, including in the Kremlin, that this position is actually a sinecure, a de facto retirement. Here's the second hawk, Belousov. He was moved from the central position of first deputy prime minister in charge of macroeconomics, which is the key story. He was moved to the position of defense minister, which in a war, of course, is important, but it's still local. In the position of first deputy prime minister, you can interfere in any sector, strictly speaking, but from the position of defense minister, you can't. When the coordinating center led by Patrushev disappeared, the new Security Council head, Shoigu, failed in the war, and Putin is unhappy with him. His deputies have been arrested, and their testimonies are unclear. The Security Council is now an empty shell. Currently, there is no single coordinating center to formulate and control instructions across sectors and regions. Sechin is an active player, overseeing FSB generals, but lacks the authority to issue orders like Patrushev's office did. It was possible from Patrushev's office, but not from Sechin's current office. Through his generals, he can put someone in jail, try to initiate criminal proceedings, but these are local opportunities. They do not create a system, so the system, let's say, remains in a half-disassembled state. The technocrats, though not doves, are more pragmatic and less idealistic. They understand the reality of the situation, failing to capture Kiev, facing sanctions, and are willing to adjust. In contrast, the hawks are ready to die for their ideals, charging forward without compromise. Technocrats, on the other hand, are not ready to die for it. They came to steal and enjoy life, not to die in a revolutionary struggle. That's why they are ready to win back. In general, they are on a roll right now. But it is important to realize that Putin can make very hawkish decisions on every issue, and periodically he makes them. We cannot say that the technocrats have won and the hawks have been completely dismantled. However, the last 6 months have seen some weakening of the technocrat camp. It is important to note that after Trump's victory, the technocrats seem to have experienced the giddiness of success. They started reasoning like Patrushev, perhaps thinking it was temporary. But when they realize that their hopes for Trump have failed, they will calm down and return to their pragmatism. They will be ready to say that, for example, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson can be given up to end the war. A compromise must be sought. That will be their position, and they will come back to it. But at least up until 10 days ago, when Trump first came in, they were acting like hawks. So I will repeat, although the general trend is to weaken the hawks, Putin has become disillusioned with their course. But from time to time, this course may revive, especially if the Russian army continues its offensive, for example in Donbass, or manages to recapture the Kursk region. Of course, these technocrats will also turn into hawks. Just as conventionally speaking, in March of the 22nd, there was no difference. Yes, they were all for Kiev in 3 days, so to speak, all the same. The split appeared when victories began to turn into defeats. You know, as they say, victory has many fathers, but defeat is always an orphan. When it became clear that defeats had to be accounted for, that's when the accusations began. Technocrats. The hawks accused the technocrats of betrayal, saying they were ready to surrender at the first sign of difficulty, while the technocrats blamed the hawks for recklessly charging ahead, leading to massive losses and leaving the army weakened. This led to infighting, with both sides blaming each other for the failures. First, the slogan, Kiev in 2 or 3 days, and then the march on Berlin was not victorious. All of this we're seeing. And again, it comes back to the fact that a lot depends on the situation on the battlefield. As I understand it, at the same time, there was talk about champagne and Trump and how loudly they opened it after November 5th. It was not as pompous as when he first became president. Expectations and confidence in Trump, who himself, I think, is not yet sure how he's going to behave toward Putin through negotiations, offers, or ultimatums. There's still some uncertainty. The mood, as you said, is not as rosy now as it was in 2016. At the time of the victory, they were quite rosy, but publicly they expressed themselves much more restrained this time. This is due to the fact that over the past 2.5 years, they have promised the Russians so many times a speedy victory, and each time it ended in disappointment. So now, having been burned at the kisser, they are blowing on water. They realize that if they start opening the champagne again, the Russians will react with irritation. How many times can we do this? Russians now recall the saying, "Don't say GOP until you jump over it," as the authorities have repeatedly celebrated success. They've decided to avoid escalating expectations to prevent disappointment and angering the public with premature celebrations. Plus, there is an element of inferiority in celebrating Trump's victory too much. It turns out that Russia is highly dependent on America, on who the president is. This contradicts Putin's concept of Russia as a superpower that has fully restored its sovereignty. So it turns out that we depend on who is in the White House, while our squabbles with Ukraine are decided by the President of the United States. Because of this, the element of inferiority was also decided to be taken into account. They celebrated in their offices, but publicly, in the State Duma, they behaved with restraint, so as not to appear disconnected from reality. CNN has reported on hundreds of Trump's peace plans in recent weeks, perhaps even months. One of them may include giving up Kiev's claims to Crimea in exchange for a
Понимаете, есть в этом элемент неполноценности. И это тоже решили учесть, поэтому в своих кабинетах-то там праздновали, да, но по телевизору и в Государственной Думе официально решили вести себя чуть более сдержанно.
Alexander Musienko, head of the Center for Military Legal Studies. Alexander, good to see you. We will go around the news that says the war is over. Welt writes that Putin has set his sights on Europe and Russia is attacking European infrastructure. The publication focuses on the fact that Putin will not stop after Ukraine. He will try to extend his influence to the Baltic states. And I would also mention Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, who says that the war may end in the coming months, all of which suggests that the war may end or leads us to talk about it. And I cannot but add to this context Scholz, who spoke to Putin for a reason, breaking his promise not to be silent, so to speak. Did talk to him, and this happened just before Putin massively shelled Ukraine, which also sends its own signals. And this is where the question arises. Is Putin raising the stakes before the talks? Are there any preconditions, any grounds for this? And is this shelling more of a disadvantage for Putin or a benefit? Because what does Trump think about it? It's hard to say what Donald Trump is looking at. I didn't see any reaction from him at all to this attack. So it's hard to say what he thinks. Maybe it will reappear, and then we can talk about something in more detail. As for the situation in general, it is clear that Putin will use all elements of pressure, including trying to find opportunities to consolidate the West around the idea that the West should put pressure on Ukraine as a weaker party, as Putin believes, so that Ukraine would make concessions. And that's why we're seeing attacks. And I think we're going to see attacks until January 20th, at least through the winter, because Russia has been building up a certain missile capability to match everything and put pressure. So Putin is creating a picture for Trump. And what should this picture be? It should confirm Donald Trump's words back at the campaign stage, when he said that Russia defeated Hitler, Napoleon, and so on, and accordingly that Russia cannot be defeated militarily. This should be the creation of this image. Secondly, of course, this is an attempt to present the situation as hopeless on the battlefield, that Russia is advancing, Ukraine is forced to defend itself and is only retreating, and it cannot be otherwise. And thirdly, it's all presented with the appropriate drama, which is what Putin wants to do.
Ну і третє, звичайно, це все подавати з відповідним, скажімо так, з відповідною драматургією, що хоче робити Путін, тому що я думаю, далі
I think he will keep trying.
Якими далі будуть ось ці атаки російські?
What these Russian attacks will look like is likely to be the same as we have seen. 2 simulation flights with simulation launches, then a possible flight with missile weapons to scale it up, to create the impression that Russian aviation is constantly in the air and has capabilities. And these are all elements of pressure, plus pressure on Europe. Because while the United States is resolving the issue of the inauguration, it is not known whether Trump will maintain funding for Ukraine, increase it, or keep it at the current level. I think that at least at the current level, he will keep it, and it will not be a fatal decision that support for Ukraine will stop. I still do not think so. But against this background, we need to activate the European factor so that Europe might get involved, and against the background of the fact that the United States might stop playing a leading role, try to put pressure on Ukraine, saying, let's negotiate. Putin wants to, and Putin's global goal is not only to put pressure on the battlefield, not only to fight, not only to terrorize the civilian population, but also other countries joined in, approaching the issue of peace through the prism of Ukraine having to make concessions. And Russia, if it does make concessions, having to make very small ones, and thus stop the fighting. This is Putin's global goal. He has the resources, and I think that these 43,000, we see the statistics of losses that Russia suffered in September and October, and they are growing and will continue to grow until January. So he is willing to pay the price by using his troops, thinking that this will be a suitable picture for Trump, and accordingly, Ukraine will be pressured. That is, this is the enemy's goal today, and he will use it. That's why, in fact, such difficult weeks are ahead. At this time, various peacekeepers will come up with proposals, let's say, let's think about it, and so on. But Ukraine's position is that we do not reject the idea of negotiations. And I have not heard anyone from the official authorities, whether the president or the foreign minister, say that we are against negotiations at all. We support a just peace, achievable only through strength. Pressuring Ukraine to negotiate now would not be from a position of strength, allowing the enemy to impose conditions. Ukraine seeks peace through strength and aims to create a strong negotiating position. Only then can we talk to Putin differently, as he doesn't understand otherwise. The fact that Scholz called Putin before this massive missile strike, it's interesting, because it seems to me that this could have been a central topic of conversation, because while there was a president, and there is Biden, why didn't Scholz call? And when Trump was elected, he decided to call. And here I have this idea that it could have been Trump's idea, and perhaps having some intelligence that Russia was already ready for this, he was trying to somehow prevent it. No, I think definitely not, and let's just say that it was impossible to prevent it, and Putin would not have listened. It's a priori impossible. As for the whole situation with this call, of course, Europe also wants to play a role. It is clear that they are stepping up, and Europe is now, let's say, between consolidating and increasing assistance to Ukraine, especially at a time when there are risks of reducing assistance from the United States. They are now starting from this, starting from the fact that they need to look for solutions and still, perhaps, play along with Trump or even get ahead of him.
Потрібно шукати якогось рішення і потрібно все ж таки, можливо, підіграти Трампу або навіть побігти поперед Трампа. Тобто вони, можливо, навіть зараз йдуть попереду того, щоб спробувати фактично знайти якісь
That is, they may be going ahead now to try to find common ground and start the negotiation process.
Вибори 23 лютого в Німеччині дострокові. І мені здається, що цей дзвінок, він ще лежить і в внутрішньополітичній площині, тому що таким чином Шольц хоче підіграти тим німецьким виборцям, які йому дорікали, що він, мовляв, недостатньо робив на посаді для встановлення миру.
Scholz's call to Putin seems to have a domestic political angle, as early elections in Germany approach. He aims to appeal to voters who criticized him for not doing enough to establish peace, talking to Putin, reducing aid to Ukraine, and avoiding escalation. Scholz likely wants to consolidate these voters ahead of uncertain elections. Despite his explanation, it's unclear how he expects Putin's position to change through phone calls.
І відповідно, чи взагалі він буде обраний канцлером, тому що в соціал-демократів різні там уже звучать думки, що можливо хай буде міністр оборони Пісторіус лідером і так далі. Тому це ще й цим пояснюється. Але Шольц пояснив свій дзвінок і сказав, що він планує ще раз зателефонувати. Так. Ну, вочевидь, причому він сказав, що Путін не змінив своєї позиції. Так, а як він її змінить за допомогою телефонних дзвінків, мені цікаво.
Putin may change his position only under pressure, when Ukraine, with the help of its partners, is able to stop the Russian offensive in the east and stabilize the front. Inflict maximum losses on Russia, and they will become more and more tangible. The supply of weapons to Ukraine, including long-range ones, along with new and tougher EU sanctions, could create a stronger position. Unlike phone calls. Their distancing, while keeping them uninvolved and safe, works for now, but they can't ignore the problem forever.
Війну не втягнуті, у них все добре, вони в своєму альянсі НАТО там відкорковують пляшки, п'ють шампанське за те, що у них безпека і все добре. З іншого боку, ігнорувати цю проблему неможливо.
Because the war is ongoing, and it is going on, and they are somehow financially involved in it. And that's why I asked the previous question, and now perhaps from the other side, from your answer, we are going to go back to this question. What do they not understand? What do they need to do? That they don't need to call 10 times and beg on their knees, but just give them banal things. Permission to beat. Well, if you go deeper, you can agree on the distance, you can agree on the objects. This information was also that all the targets were already equipped, registered. That is, we are not talking about hitting some civilian house or something. We are talking about a specific military facility on the territory of Russia, specifically, which will move towards us. This is not clear.
Справа в тому, що, скажімо так, зараз треба розуміти, що в світі і в Європі, зокрема, пішов тренд на мир.
The fact is that we need to understand that the world, and Europe in particular, is trending toward peace and peaceful negotiations. And within this trend, the main thing for us is that this peace does not come at our expense, at the expense of our surrender and our unilateral concessions, which will actually amount to surrender. There are two approaches here. The first is that this trend will continue, and we will still be forced to make concessions, but we will hold out as long as we can. If we hold out until January 20th, a U.S. special representative for the Russian-Ukrainian war will be appointed, and the issue will be seriously addressed. The Ukrainian president has said he will talk to Trump, valuing his opinion over his entourage, noting their productive meeting in September.
І Трамп багато в чому дослухався до тих ініціатив, які Україна пропонує. Тому звідси друга позиція, яка мені...
So from here, the second position, which I certainly like better, and I expect it to happen, is that the United States under the Trump administration will behave somewhat differently than under the Biden administration, and may even increase aid to force Russia to the negotiating table and make concessions.
стіл перемовин і йти на поступки.
This is actually the second scenario.
Другий сценарій, який може бути, при цьому це не означає, що ось цей
This does not mean that this, let's say, trend toward negotiations, which is being discussed in all the world's media, will disappear. No, it is simply taking on a completely different tone, more positive for us and more useful for us in terms of ensuring a strong position. In addition, we need to understand the following. What is important now is to stop the Russian offensive and stabilize the front. Then there is the hope that these weapons, which are now promised by the current U.S. administration, the Biden administration, will arrive faster, and we will be able to arm our brigades, which have already been created and are undergoing training, but need more weapons.
Потребують більшого озброєння, і ми зможемо навіть покращувати ситуацію тактично на полі бою, і це, звичайно,
This will allow us to improve the tactical situation on the battlefield, including some offensive actions, and this will certainly change attitudes, because without this, let's say, the narrative needs to be broken, as happened with the Kursk operation. We need this outbreak, and as soon as it appears, or the opportunity for it, I am sure that the Trump administration will react in a completely different way. They will perceive some things differently. But before that, of course, there will be a lot of calls, discussions, attempts to find out something, publications in the media, because there is a tendency to come to some kind of decision by the end of 2025.
Але це ще рік, треба сказати. Це не значить, що це відбудеться. Це ще рік, протягом якого буде тривати війна. Але вийти при цьому на якесь рішення, яке буде, я думаю, що
But that's another year, and that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's another year during which the war will continue, and to come to some kind of solution, which is likely to be, although I think not before the end of 2025, to end this war. In the medium term, our diplomacy can use the missile strikes that took place today to get what we need from our partners, either weapons or permits or something else. On the other hand, I understand that we survived the missile attack quite well. Member of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on Energy, MP Nagornyak, says that the energy sector did not suffer critical damage. According to him, Ukraine easily withstood today's massive attack from an energy point of view. What I'm saying is that when things end badly, there are more headlines, and we can demand more from our partners. And when we can fight back, it's harder to ask for more. I would also like to put this situation on the shelves. Let's face it, I'm not a power engineer, of course, but today there were hits on energy facilities in different regions of Ukraine. That's one thing. And secondly, if we are getting through everything easily, we also need to understand why there are emergency or stabilization blackouts.
Чому у нас виникають екстрені або стабілізаційні відключення, теж треба розуміти. Третій момент, не применшуючи...
The third point is the role of our air defense system, which means that it worked very well, and although the attack was large-scale, it could have been much worse. I understand this very well, and am aware of it, and this should also be emphasized. The next factor is that the enemy will try to attack again. I mean, the question here is that I don't think this is the only attack. I think they have set a trend and the beginning of what they will try to attack again. And here, everyone can see everything perfectly. Our partners and everyone else, it is enough to show footage from Odessa or other places that were attacked, and everything becomes clear. And the actual destruction of civilian houses, not only in Kharkiv and Sumy regions, is clear. But Scholz will respond to this by saying that he will not give Taurus, but will give more air defense, the ARIS system. That is, he has already decided that Ukraine needs more air defense. Our partners say that we need more systems for defense, and so one of the big aid packages by the end of Biden's term will be the delivery of interceptor missiles. We are also waiting for the delivery of the Patriot systems that were promised during the Washington NATO summit. This is a strengthening of air defense, and they are responding. And from the point of view of the overall situation, we don't know for sure whether Trump had a conversation with Putin or not. The Americans have neither denied nor confirmed it. Therefore, if what the Washington Post wrote is true, that Trump urged Putin not to escalate, then excuse me, Putin actually sent Trump away by his actions. And this changes the situation. Trump may not have come out publicly with this now, but he sees it as a case directly against him. There is no other way to take it. And this is exactly the clue. Therefore, in this version, it would be better if they talked, and the content of the conversation was exactly as the Washington Post reported. Because when Putin humiliates Trump, when he demonstrates that he does not care what the newly elected president of the United States says to him, this could seriously affect Trump and influence his future decisions as president after January 20th.
І це буде відзначатися і позначатись на майбутніх його рішеннях в якості вже президента після 20 січня.